Well, thank you for coming. Maybe we can get started. The environmentalists are always the most rowdy, so I think... Well, thank you for coming and joining us on the George P. Smith II Distinguished Professorship Inaugural Lecture, Letting Go of Stability, Resilience, and Environmental Law. These events are particularly nice for us whenever we have a friend of the law school that's creating a new professorship. It allows us to celebrate one of the most important aspects of the law school's mission, which is how we advance knowledge and the research of our tremendous faculty. This event, though, is particularly important because not only are we able to celebrate that research mission through the creation of a new professorship that will ultimately become a distinguished chair, but this is done by somebody who is an alum of the law school and also a faculty member himself. And so today we celebrate not only Rob's achievements with his research over a long and distinguished career, we also are able to celebrate the tremendous achievements and accomplishments of George Smith and his distinguished career too. George is going to do an introduction of Rob, and so I'm going to not do that, but instead I'm going to give you a little bit of background of George, his impact on the legal profession and on legal academia, and also his tremendous contributions to Indiana University. George Smith is a 1964 alumnus of the law school, and it is not an exaggeration to say that he is an internationally recognized scholar and lecturer. He's a professor emeritus of law at Catholic University at America's Columbus School of Law. In a career that spanned more than 50 years in teaching and public service, 39 of which were spent at Catholic University, Professor Smith made a difference, whether that was in the area of property law, land use, environmental law, bioethics, public health law. In 1968, with his path-breaking scholarship on artificial insemination, and in that area of law, it established him as on the front, as an insightful voice in the then emerging field of bioethics of law, science, and medicine. What's important with George is not only has he done great things, but the university has recognized him over many years for those contributions. The CV is too long to go into, but just a few highlights. In 1985, IU conferred upon Professor Smith the Silver Medallion as a Distinguished Service Alumnus, and in 1998, an honorary degree was conferred upon him. He also created the Distinguished Professorship Chair that same year in his honor at the law school here. We again in 2007 honored Professor Smith by inducting him into the Academy of Law Alumni Fellows, which is the highest honor that we can bestow upon any of our grads. In 2008, a fellowship in the LM program was created at Indiana University in his honor. And he also played a key role in establishing the endowed professorship at the law school, honoring the late Professor Harry Prater. Today, Professor Smith still remains very energetic and continues his scholarly research and writing in the field of international human rights, currently at the Indiana University Institute of Advanced Study as a residential fellow. I hope you'll join me in a very warm welcome and appreciation for George Smith.
When Milt and Judy Stewart, when the center was created and dedicated on October the 16th, that is the Center for Global Legal Profession, I was struck by Milt's very moving remarks about the importance of Indiana University in his professional and in his personal life. I, too, have enduring gratitude for the university for shaping my life in a positive manner and encouraging me never to forget, in the words of John Milton, that a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit. Interestingly, these very words are carved over the entrance to Franklin Hall, which in my day was the main library. Notable among my book teachers at Indiana University were Harry Prater, John Grimes, Mary Gaither, Clifford Kirkpatrick, Mary Elizabeth Campbell, Ross Robertson, Harry Yamaguchi, Ross Allen, and Fred Whitney. In 1961, my professional life began when I was a freshman at Indiana University Law School. The values that I learned have shaped and directed my whole life plan. Indeed, I think of my life as being held together by metaphorically bookends, two bookends. One by my profession, and the other by the arts and culture. I often wonder, without these bookends, whether my intellectual and my personal lives would have ever developed. Perhaps I would have been just another Willie Loman character immortalized in Arthur Miller's play Death of a Salesman, and thus be seen as little more than a ship in search of a harbor. Thanks to the artistic vision and management of Wilfred Bain, Charles Webb, and Gwynne Richards, outstanding deans of the School of Music, my cultural life took hold and remains vibrant to this day. Every time I return to campus, I find my refuge and my cultural accelerator at the Musical Arts Center. Additionally, my spirit is always nurtured by the ministry of music by Dr. Marilyn Kaiser at Trinity Church, a ministry which, as Anglicans say, allow me to experience a peace and tranquility which surpasses understanding. Upon my demise, a second Smith Professorship Chair will be inaugurated at the School of Music, and thereby allows me to complete my bookends. Long before I came to Indiana University and placed it on the radar screen, I had the exceedingly good fortune at Wabash High School to have 3 inspirational teachers who taught me that there was indeed an intellectual radar screen and that I could gain access to it by realizing that my reach should always exceed my grasp. Further, it was all right to be a nerd. Believe me, being able to accept this status as a nerd was especially challenging in the 1950s. To Ruth Jones, Mildred Hipskin, and Martha Biggerstaff Jones, I owe a lifetime debt of gratitude. How honored I am that Martha Jones's son Pete and her daughter-in-law Susie are here today. And one of the noble successors in interest at Wabash High to the legacy of Ruth, Mildred, and Martha, Jan Rowland, is here as well. I thank all of you for coming today. I was excited in 1992 when young Rob Fischman joined the faculty here at the Maurer School of Law. As I'm excited and honored today with Rob's elevation to the Smith Distinguished Professorship. For I see this appointment as a creative and supportive force that will allow Rob to continue his distinguished work in the legal academy and thus build upon his outstanding record as a scholar and national policymaker. From his 1984 graduation at Princeton summa cum laude and his award-winning senior thesis entitled A Study of Peralkaline Ash Flow Sequence, Gran Canaria, very nice title, Rob, to his MS and JD degrees from the University of Michigan in 1987, and to his arrival at the Maurer School of Law, Rob has realized in every way the great promise that he brought to the legal community as a distinguished and prodigious scholar, gifted teacher, and as a thoughtful policymaker in natural resources law. His path-breaking books in federal public law and resource law, national wildlife and environmental law are complemented richly by some 45 law review articles and 32 essays, book chapters, and reports. Taken together with 73 selected conference and seminar presentations, Rob's record of accomplishment is the very reason that I nominated him to Dean Parrish for this professorship. This appointment allows me in a very, very small way to express my enduring gratitude and underscore my loyalty to Indiana University, as well as to acknowledge the enlightened direction that the Maurer School of Law has taken in implementing the blueprint for national and international preeminence, which was first laid out by Dean Fred Amon and so successfully developed by Dean Lauren Robel and presently by Dean Austin Parrish. Young Rob, the podium is yours.
Got to set my timer here. Thank you, George, for your generosity, both to the university and to me. I wish the young Rob could be here with us. He would be very, very surprised. Before I begin, I want to recognize my parents, Noah and Barbara Fischman. They're new residents to Bloomington, sitting in the back row, the couple beaming with pride. Next to them is Lucy Fischman, my wife, whose support has never flagged despite my unreasonable work habits. Yes, Lucy? And I just want to recognize one other special guest, Professor Dan Tarlock, one of the founders of environmental law, who served this law school as a professor from 1968 until 1981. I'm really honored, Dan, to have you make the trip out here. Dan Tarlog embodies a long tradition at Indiana University of innovative scholarship in environmental law. My aim today will be to discuss resilience, which is an important framework for understanding how we might better respond to disruptive changes that we currently experience and drastic ones yet to come. Resilience also happens to be the focus of a new IU Institute that I've co-founded with a wonderful group of colleagues as part of a Grand Challenge grant to help people better prepare for environmental change. So my interest in resilience, though newfound, is both intellectual and also practical. We've got to get this institute up and running. Right, Ellen? Now, I know that George Smith is a serious scholar whose gift seeks to cultivate serious research. In that spirit, I'm working on an article addressing the role of resilience in environmental law. This lecture is a summary of the high points of that research, which I hope to publish in his honor as my inaugural contribution to this new professorship. I plan to talk for 40 minutes. At that point, students who need to leave to go to class should get up and go, and we'll probably have about 5 to 10 minutes of questions. For as long as legal historians trace back the roots of Anglo-American law, we've pushed against notions. We've pushed against the unpredictability of nature. Law facilitates modifications to the environment in order to create more favorable conditions for reliable transportation, steady supplies of food and energy, abatement of waste. At one time, a comforting balance of nature view of the environment promised continued, steady ecological services. After learning that ecosystems do not conform to that notion, sustainability seemed to offer the path forward. But today, disruptive changes pose challenges for environmental law as guarantor of stability. While much environmental law has sought to remediate and restore damage done to the environment, other aspects provided the solace that the best, last, untouched, intact, untainted systems would be preserved. Though all generations observe environmental change, the kinds of changes we observe today are qualitatively different, accelerating at historically unprecedented rates, and unraveling ecosystems. So we need new organizing principles to grapple with new kinds of change. The ecologist Buzz Holling defined resilience as the ability of a system to absorb change yet still persist. For law and other systems that include people, it's the continuity of relationships within a system. Resilience is a measure of the ability of these systems to absorb changes, yet still provide the same function, structure, and identity. Resilience speaks to a yearning in the field of environmental law for an organizing framework. At the same time, it presents some pitfalls that cannot be easily overcome. Resilience will upset long-standing expectations of stability and predictability, and it may be limited in its power to steer reform of law itself, as opposed to merely the objectives law seeks to achieve. I will begin by discussing environmental law itself and reviving an old debate about whether it revolves around a central organizing principle. Then I'll describe how the resilience framework can improve environmental management. To employ resilience in setting goals, we must pour social and ethical content into it. In other words, resilience gets us nowhere without deciding resilience of what, to what, and for whom. Finally, even if resilience does provide a superior framework for establishing goals, we must consider the design of environmental law itself and whether it needs to be more resilient. Part 1. Does environmental law need an overarching goal? Modern environmental law arose in the 60s and 70s as Congress awoke to public discontent with the record of courts and states in safeguarding public health and conserving the natural world. Despite its current middle age, American environmental law has never completely shaken its inferiority complex as a newcomer to the repertoire of fields of legal scholarship. Environmental law seeks to optimize allocation, but also to distribute goods and services in an equitable fashion. Now, Professor Tarlock, who I mentioned before, grappled with the problem of legal content in environmental law when he asked, is there a there there? Tarlock noted, the least satisfactory response is simply that, well, environmental law exists and that content is the there. Generations of environmental law students, some of whom are in the room here, can attest there is no shortage of content to be discovered by taking a deep dive into statutory detail. But does that content contribute anything special to the law in order to justify environmental law as its own subject category? Is it just that the environment is the subject of legislation? Tarlock worried that the lack of integration of environmental law into the older doctrines of the legal system leaves it vulnerable to marginalization as support for environmentalism ebbs and flows. Federal environmental law is particularly vulnerable because, unlike state constitutions, the U.S. Constitution provides only weak footing for environmental legislation. To be a distinct field, environmental law needs a framework to resolve disputes in a way that consistently advances a broader goal. A recent example of how the under-theorized content of environmental law can undermine attempts to improve environmental management is Michigan versus EPA. In that 2015 case, a bare majority of the U.S. Supreme Court found that the agency could not set an emission standard for hazardous air pollutants without considering the cost to power plants. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to control certain pollutants if it concludes that regulation is appropriate and necessary. Relying on the fidelity of environmental law to protecting public health, EPA emphasized the Clean Air Act's goal of avoiding injuries, morbidity, and mortality reasonably anticipated to occur from the emissions. Yet the majority of the Supreme Court applied only the general principles of administrative law and statutory construction in concluding that costs must be a part of the EPA's considerations in order to produce an appropriate and necessary rule. If the Supreme Court understood environmental law as a field advancing some kind of central precept of precaution, then one justice may have switched sides, and the EPA would not be considering costs in deciding whether to regulate hazardous air pollution, especially mercury, to avoid reasonably anticipated harms. Instead, cost analysis would be deferred to the later step of deciding what kind of emission restrictions should apply to power plants. Depending on how one circumscribes the domain of environmental law, the strongest overarching theme is caution. This essential conservatism of environmental law developed in response to the shortcomings of common law in responding to prospective, probabilistic harms that are often far removed in time and space from multiple synergistic causes. Professor Richard Lazarus succeeded Dan Tarlock at this law school, beginning in 1983. Building on the work of Professor Sachs, Lazarus distilled the essential premise of environmental law as understanding that the physical characteristics of the ecosystem generate spatial and temporal spillovers that require restrictions on the private use of resources far beyond those contemplated by centuries-old common law tort rules. Amplified by the exorbitance and impossibility of reversing some environmental injuries, environmental law generally takes a preventive rather than remedial stance. Precaution is the key principle. This conservatism about safety is relatively new to what Dan Tarlock called the internal logic of the common law tradition. The revolutionary project is redefining harm as long-term risk of future illness or ecosystem malfunction rather than just immediate effects. But this principle of environmental law has been slow to permeate other institutions. Tarlock ultimately settled on the procedural innovations of environmental statutes as its greatest contribution to legal thought. Using the National Environmental Policy Act, familiarly known as NEPA, Tarlock found that environmental law is less concerned with consistent outcomes than it is to fidelity to process, such as environmental impact analysis compelled by NEPA. Of course, lawyers by training love process, so it's never a surprise when a law professor identifies process as the key innovation. Yet the procedural foundations of environmental law are based on what is a kind of crumbling faith in comprehensive rationality as a feasible way to move forward with accounting for the effects of activities. Comprehensive rationality relies on the power of foresight to accurately predict the effects of actions. Adaptation to climate change and other factors leading to new ranges of variation of environmental conditions and ecosystem phase changes will require new legal processes. Part 2, does resilience provide a useful framework for environmental law? Environmental law is one element in a system of governance, which is a process of setting goals and achieving them through social institutions. In part because of its defensive grasping for some core principle, environmental law scholarship tends toward overeager embrace of the latest trends. In the 1980s, sustainability, or sustainable development in the international context, became a common theme of reform proposals. Sustainability is a helpful prompt for identifying overexploitation of resources before they crash, but it is opaque when it comes to understanding sustainability of what. The very ambiguity that allowed sustainability to be widely hailed, that it could be interpreted by different interests as sustaining their own needs, undermined its usefulness. The Trump administration's objectives with respect to energy roughly translate to sustainability. That is, of current fossil fuel energy systems, 2, growing social concern over the global injustice of climate change, 4, people who benefit from the industry and are largely insulated from its adverse effects. Also, sustainability assumes that there are desirable states of being for systems that humans can maintain indefinitely. That assumption is not accurate for the vast majority of social ecological systems. A term associated with IU's own Ostrom workshop, social ecological systems, encompasses the connected social, economic, and environmental relationships involved in such activities as farming or managing urban stormwater. Professor Ostrom took the ecological resilience concept of Holling and extended it to the order observed in relationships between and among the environment and the people who shape and use it. She generalized the ecological principle to describe resilience as the amount of disruption needed to transform a system from one stability domain, characterized by a configuration of mutually reinforcing processes and structures, to another. Well, social ecological systems are complex. Rather than simplifying them into sustained outputs, resilience recognizes the dynamic systems and our understandings of them are relatively unpredictable. Disruptive change can occur quickly and non-linearly. The resilience of a system is the extent to which it can respond to stressors and retain its essential form. When systems cross critical thresholds, they transform into different phases. Familiar example of that is a clear lake that absorbs and purifies water. The lake's resilience describes the stock and flow of nutrients it can absorb without flipping into a eutrophic phase dominated by algae. Once the lake transforms into a eutrophic state, it may no longer bounce back into a clear lake, even if the nutrient flows abate. Humpty Dumpty is not easily put back together. Social systems, such as banking, undergo similar resilient behavior. The subprime mortgage business hummed along quite steadily until it crashed to a completely different phase in 2008. As complex as our economy or a lake's ecology might be, the interactions between the two in a social ecological system complicate the picture even more. Now, system resilience is not always good or bad from the point of view of social goals. Most people would say we should try to maintain North American bird migration in its current state by enhancing its resilience to change through, say, such practices as better water management in the upper Great Plains. But the organizing principle of resilience may lead us to social choices that push other systems across phase change boundaries. For resilience is not always associated with health or with an environment that functions in a way that benefits us. One demonstration project of our Grand Challenge will partner with public and non-governmental agencies, as well as Indianapolis citizens living near the Pleasant Run Creek. That is an urban system full of impermeable surfaces that currently provides relatively few ecological services to relatively poor residents. One legitimate way about thinking of a goal for the Pleasant Run system is to nudge it across the resilience threshold into a new state that better serves people in the area and downstream. Indeed, one reason why funding is available for altering the system is that law mandates that Indianapolis abate stormwater pollution and slow the ever-increasing surges of runoff that flow into the White River after heavy downpours. Most debates about applying resilience as a legal objective have arisen in the preservationist context of enhancing resilience and keeping systems within the limits to avoid disruptive transformation. But Pleasant Run shows that resilience is equally helpful in framing a legal system that facilitates transformations to new systems that better serve people. Cities will be the testing grounds for transformative management that aims to shift the role of waterways from, say, hidden pipes to community gathering grounds that provide a diversity of goods and services that had been wiped off the map. Equating resilience in environmental law with resisting phase changes is a common misunderstanding of resilience as sustainability. Instead, adaptive governance to promote transformation will become increasingly important, and not just in ill-functioning urban watersheds. Perhaps our greatest current environmental challenge is decarbonizing our energy systems. Projects such as the Deep Decarbonization Pathways organization is fundamentally about using law to drive a transformation in the social ecological system of energy production and use. Whether at the scale of a local watershed or a national energy system, transformative governance provides hope to people shut out of previous conceptions of environmental decision-making. By retaining the notion that environmental law is for people, serving their provisioning needs and resolving their disputes, resilience of social ecological systems gets us away from dualist notions of nature versus society that seldom help the environmentalist cause. For instance, Greg Sakanik, currently Alaska Regional Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, commented on the current dispute over whether to drill for oil in his Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. He said that America's refuges are dedicated to, quote, wildlife conservation over human use, unquote. A resilience framework would consider wildlife conservation to be human use. The two are linked in the social ecological system. A similar separation of the social from the ecological led the Idaho Supreme Court to deny implied federal reserved water rights for Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge. Federal public land law reserves to the United States implied water rights needed to avoid frustration of the primary purpose for creating the refuge. President Franklin Roosevelt created Deer Flat Refuge to preserve and provide breeding or resting grounds for native birds on the islands in a stretch of the Snake River. As part of Idaho's adjudication of water rights on the Snake, the Supreme Court rejected the United States claim that the reservation required enough water to flow through the snake by the islands during bird breeding season to ensure that they remained isolated from the riverbanks. Without the in-stream flow rights, irrigation upstream of the refuge sometimes lowers water flows so much that the refuge islands become peninsulas, which then subjects nesting birds to predatory animals. The Idaho court held that denying the water rights and allowing the land bridges to form between the islands and the riverbanks would not defeat the purpose of the refuge. It justified its position by explaining that the reserves were intended to benefit humans as the primary focus. The court wrote, quote, "It's inconceivable that President Roosevelt intended to give preference to waterfowl or any other migratory bird over people," unquote. A more honest assessment of that decision is that it shifted resilience of the Snake River social ecological system from serving people who benefit from birds to people who benefit from more irrigation upstream. Separating conservation from benefits to people misunderstands the role of wildlife in the environment. In a political competition, if we make it people versus other animals, I think I'll bet on people. Resilience is an organizing principle that makes it easier to see how the two are inseparable. Hunters of caribou and waterfowl, well south of the refuge breeding grounds, are part of a social ecological system. So are bird watchers, and we should not discount the role of these systems in supporting agriculture itself through the breeding of birds that reduce crop losses by, say, eating insect pests. One reason resilience works well for environmental law is that it's not easily confused with an outcome, as is the case of sustainability. Resilience is a property we work with in pursuing some social vision we get from a system of ethics or morals. To do that, we need better tools to achieve the goals that resilience helps us understand what the trade-offs are. We need better tools. They've got to be more iterative and less front-loaded than those required by NEPA and the Administrative Procedure Act. Adaptive management fits that bill by treating actions as experiments to test hypotheses about how the environment responds to human alterations. It requires continuous monitoring and flexibility to tinker with environmental management. Those needs can be facilitated through legal reform. Despite the awkward fit between the comprehensive rationality of environmental impact analysis and, say, adaptive management, it's an exciting time to be working in environmental law and being imaginative about procedures that will better incorporate a more confident sense, better increase the predictability of success when we undertake projects or regulations to achieve certain particular goals. Okay, well, what goals? Part 3, society demands stability. The fallacy of naturalism that cautions that observed attributes of nature are not necessarily ethical should give us pause. In adopting a framework for setting environmental goals, we need to tread carefully and critically examine whether resilience actually serves the interests and morals of people. The title of this lecture is Letting Go of Stability, because a major challenge to resilience as an organizing framework is that legal fidelity to finality and security comes from real social demands. People like stability. People want to rely on the environment to provide goods and services to which they become accustomed. Adults delight when children experience the same parks and fishing holes they recall from their youth. Lenders want assurances that their investments will be protected from environmental variability. How can we reconcile such sometimes unrealistic demands with resilience? Now, a hallmark of system resilience is that it can enhance the capacity to maintain a high level of consistency of behavioral structure in the face of a dynamic environment. That's why it is sometimes easy to confuse resilience with stability. But some dynamic changes inevitably push systems over the line into new states that may produce very different goods and services. Resilience provides tools to help us grapple with changes in the variability of environmental conditions that have served as benchmarks, such as 100-year flood notions. High variability and low predictability are probably the greatest challenges for maintaining resilience and adaptive capacity in environmental law. What was natural, such as a particular flood frequency, or native, such as a particular set of tick species, is no longer a reliable guide for management. Resilience will promise less, but can deliver more of what it promises. Now, first we have to be clear, again, that resilience, which literally from its etymology gives people the sense that it means systems leap back to their former state after shocks, is a misunderstanding. That's engineering resilience or robustness. Ecological resilience, though, is just the measure of how much alteration a system can absorb before losing its recoil. Now, there's some hope for law to consider softening its demand for stability. Over the long term, even the common law shows a willingness to bend to new conditions. Many historians use the 19th century shift in riparian water rights from a natural flow guarantee to reasonable use as an illustration of how common law accommodates economic imperatives, in that case expressed in a new landscape of industrialized dams and reservoirs and mills. Now, Professor Smith, the benefactor of this professorship, has shown in a series of articles how common law can and does continue to respond to many changes in social attitudes toward the environment. In particular, Smith demonstrated that common law judges are able to contextualize aspects of the environment, such as trees, in order to determine where they add value to the landscape and when they may be a nuisance. Through consideration of the social, cultural context, the court can act as a counterweight to inflexible statutory directives. Others have identified an evolutionary pattern to statutory environmental law itself that's not terribly different from the pattern we can see in common law's relationship to resilience. People have difficulty seeing the world as a chaotic, probabilistic system where causation is never direct. People respond more strongly to identified particular individuals facing slight harm than to currently unknown probabilistic people facing greater harm. How can the law prompt people to care more about these stochastic consequences of decisions? Well, on the conservation side of environmental law, advocates have long observed that emotion is important, but often neglected. Resilience seems too cold a term to inspire social change. Wendell Berry expressed the concern this way: "We know enough of our own history by now to be aware that people exploit what they have merely concluded to be of value, but what they defend is what they love. To defend what we love, we need a particularizing language, for we love what we particularly know. Affinity to place motivates environmental protection. Environmental law needs to find a way to take more seriously this human yearning for connection. What most of us know are ordinary places, ordinary components of the natural side of the social ecological system play important roles in modulating phase changes. Environmental law too often arrives late to a crisis, when problems are nearly insoluble. This is almost always the case with endangered species recovery. The not knowing what you've got till it's gone syndrome has hamstrung environmental law with too many objectives that set it up for failure. Greater focus on keeping the common abundant rather than simply trying to nurse the rare would be a beneficial turn in environmental law. Bird migrations are a good example of still abundant ecological phenomena that can help sustain social ecological systems. Rather than waiting until obligate migrants decline to the point of imperilment, taking steps early to secure the long-term future of migration could be a bigger contribution to social well-being. Similarly, concentrating area-wide preserves in places of monumental scenery, such as national parks, will protect little biodiversity. Yet, biodiversity is the redundant ecological elements that often maintain resilience. This is another reason why demonstrating the importance of conservation in places like the agricultural landscape of the lower Wabash system is so important. The productivity of ordinary places often far exceeds the services provided by more remote environments. One approach as we move forward into a future of environmental conditions that cannot sustain historically occurring ecosystems is to cultivate species and services we want. Gardening the environment appeals to many Americans' religious sense of stewardship. It connects care for the backyard with care for the planet. It also serves as an apt metaphor for many conservation innovations that will counteract the effects of climate change. But history cautions that what we think we want, from channelized rivers to cheap glucose, may turn out in the end to do more harm than good. Some species cannot be rescued from extinction. Resilient scholars often push for more flexibility in statutes, such as the Endangered Species Act, but to replace conceptually flawed yet practically powerful objectives with vague missions to garden ecosystems is a recipe for failure. Voluntary, polycentric, collaborative conservation may be our preference for successful environmental management, but strict legal thresholds undergird such successes. The Endangered Species Act, in particular, with its divine command to prevent extinctions, an impossible task from the perspective of resilience, is nonetheless a regulatory driver of about half of the hundreds of conservation collaborations studied by Professors Steve Yaffe and Julia Wondalik. As my colleague David Polly and others have pointed out, environmental governance is a continuum of practices between the two extreme poles of preserving historical landscapes on the one hand and gardening entirely novel ecosystems on the other. In fact, the idea of untamed primeval nature has always been an ideal, not a reality in environmental law. Gardening as a metaphor for incremental adjustments in response to management activities that also serve as adaptive experiments is well suited to describe the thematic aim of environmental law today. But gardening as erasing the existing environment to create something entirely new is probably just as unrealistic and dangerous an approach as resisting environmental change up to the very point of futility. Finally, the last part. Should environmental law itself be resilient? Answering whether environmental law itself should be more resilient plunges us into the constitutive question of how institutions and procedures are structured. In other words, it asks, how should we decide how to decide? Questions of justice and participation underlie this environmental law reform challenge. Ultimately, environmental law must establish a framework for collective governance. Another way to frame the issue, then, is whether resilience in law gives voice to people in an equitable manner. Resilience may sacrifice stability, but it can deliver better distributional results by integrating the social with the ecological in systems analysis. A more resilient environmental law would be designed not as a fail-safe, static utopia. Instead, resilience demands a safe-fail approach that recognizes constant change and adjustment. Unlike systems resistant to change, safe-fail law encourages openness and experimentation. Resilient law would mirror the bottom-up approach to managing the commons so commonly associated with the Ostrom's Bloomington School. Resilient law would provide avenues for citizens to express preferences and influence decisions. If Ambassador Bryce was correct that the national park system is America's best idea, then Professor Caldwell's environmental impact analysis is our most copied idea. Both have roots in the transcendental philosophy popularized by Emerson, Thoreau, and Maurer, patriarchs of the environmental movement. Thoreau in particular called for the morality of living deliberately. Fenn Montague characterizes this as a system of weighing the moral consequences of one's actions. Resilience is a new framework for weighing those consequences. The environmental justice movement is not so much a separate subfield of environmental law, but a clear demand that environmental law live up to its ambitions of moral consideration in evaluating effects. Consideration of the full range of consequences is not merely a technocratic balancing of discounted and monetized costs versus benefits. It's a moral calculus. Parks are good not just because they create tourist revenue and improve public health, they're also good because they shape the moral character of people. Mark Sagoff observed that if we leave to future generations an environment that is fit for pigs, they will be like pigs. Their tastes will adapt to their conditions as ours might when we move from the country into town. Suppose that we destroyed all of our artistic, literary, and musical heritage. We would then ensure a race of uncultured near illiterates. Now suppose we leave an environment dominated by dumps and highways. Again, we will ensure a future of individuals will be illiterate, although in another way. Surely we should strive to make the human race better. Surely it is morally bad for us to deteriorate into a pack of yahoos who have lost both knowledge of and taste for the things that give value and meaning to life. Future generations might not complain. A pack of yahoos will like a junkyard environment. This is the problem. That kind of future is efficient. It may well be equitable, but it is tragic all the same. Our obligation to provide future individuals with an environment consistent with ideals we know to be good is an obligation not necessarily to those individuals, but to the ideals themselves. So Professor Sagoff reminds us that moral consequences are not pure calculations, but expressions of our aspirations. Former Fish and Wildlife Service Director Molly Beattie expressed this view in saying, what a country chooses to save is what a country chooses to say about itself. Shaping the world requires considerations of distributive justice, but also an articulation of our aspirations for the future. One might characterize, again, the Trump administration's energy policies as temporarily parochial in their reluctance to pay the price today for the future injuries built into the greenhouse gas pollution that has already been emitted into the atmosphere. They've locked future generations into a different social, environmental, social ecological system that without having considered what those impacts might be. So let me conclude with two overall observations. What does resilience mean for environmental law? Two things. First, environmental law's core principle of precaution through process should be strengthened rather than replaced somehow with resilience. Resilience is not a normative term, it is a property of our world. Resilience delivers better understanding of how caution operates in complex systems and motivates imaginative new procedural tools. It discourages a futile search for certainty or finality in systems essentially characterized by high variability and low predictability. We need to incorporate more experimentation in all environmental decisions. Adaptive management requires softening our commitment to final agency actions and res judicata without letting go of enforceable substantive standards. Crude rules of thumb, such as bans on discharges without permits or prohibitions on jeopardizing endangered species, must continue to play a role because our knowledge will always fall short of understanding the full repercussions of actions in complex adaptive systems. Default rules establishing burdens of proof in common law and administrative settings need root-to-branch reassessment in light of the resilience framework. Conservation is restraint and thus conservative, but it is not sustainability and should not foreclose transformation. Resilient environmental law helps us identify circumstances where stability is infeasible or undesirable. Second, resilience as a management tool offers a framework for confronting the social drivers of unjust and inadequate outcomes of decades of environmental management that excluded some people. To live deliberately requires we consider carefully distributive impacts as moral consequences. Environmental law must provide paths for social change. Social power structures may need to yield to better ways of provisioning social systems. During World War II, C.S. Lewis wrote that man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. Only the environmental justice strand of environmental law has forthrightly dealt with this long-standing reality. With the echo of Eleanor Ostrom in our ears, the legal response to environmental crises must address the social dimension to environmental law. So, thanks very much for your attention. We have 10 minutes for questions or comments. This is a good time for people who have to leave to run to a 1 o'clock class to get up and scurry off. But if anyone has a question or comment, just raise your hand. Yes, the gentleman in the open-collared white shirt. Okay. To repeat the question, the breakdown in comprehensive rationality poses challenges for environmental impact analysis, but what does it mean for economic analysis? Now, if by economic analysis you mean cost-benefit analysis, right, which is one form of economic analysis, then I think the challenge is the same as it is for environmental impact analysis. It's not that we shouldn't include consideration of costs and benefits into what we think about. It's that we need to understand that we can't foresee, we can't predict with confidence what those effects will be. That means that it, after a certain point, is futile to try to front load the process with too much information, because that information may prove to be irrelevant at best or counterproductive at worst. So, for economic analysis, what we need are opportunities to revisit the allocational success, to revisit who gains and who loses from a decision, and that's where the need for flexibility, greater flexibility comes in, which is a real challenge for a legal system that puts a great significance on what is a final agency action. And I think that in thinking through, say, administrative law and the mechanisms and restraints on the ability of people to challenge an agency decision, there's going to need to be some give and take. So Agencies, I think in exchange for saying that agencies do not need to slavishly adhere to an initial decision, in exchange there need to be other points along the way of implementation where not just the agency can alter in response to, say, new economic information, but where other people who want a say in the process can come in and challenge an agency with new information or with results of the action that seem to undermine the very reason for conducting it in the first place. We've got time for one more question or comment. Dan. Okay, so the question is, what does resilience or my lecture have to say to the current political climate where there's great polarization? I think the key point that I'd want to make there is that resilience can help people understand that there is no separation between the social and the ecological. That when we talk about the goals of environmental law, even if the objectives are described in terms of the state of, say, a wetland or the ambient exposure to people by a Superfund site, that, well, forget about that. Let's take the example of the wetland, that, that those conditions have a connection to social components and social objectives. That the reason we have wetlands that breed biodiversity is not just for the biodiversity, it's that there are helpful consequences of that for people, for certain people who may not be aware that they're gaining from those services of the social ecological system. So as an educator, I have to say, you know, there's a really important role for education in helping people to see the world around them as not, oh, this is a city, this is the built environment, I'm going to go to a park, that will be the natural environment. But to see our entire landscape as a kind of continuum of influences that are even toward the extremes embedded in social ecological conditions that are providing goods and services to people. Well, thank you very much for the questions and for your patience today. We have a reception upstairs on the 3rd floor in the faculty lounge, and all of you who have stuck with it this long have earned the right to have some snacks. So I hope to see you all upstairs.